I'm up here to introduce our last speaker. Lelkes is an associate professor at the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. He received his PhD in communication from Stanford University with a minor in psychology, and he also holds a graduate degree in political science, giving him quite an interdisciplinary perspective on polarization, and I think enabling him to speak the same languages as most of us in the room today, which is a rarity. So in addition to his faculty appointment, Yphtach is the director of the Center for Information Networks and Democracy and co-director of the Polarization Research Lab, along with Sean Westwood and Shanto Iyengar. He studies public opinion, political psychology, and political communication with a particular emphasis in polarization and American politics. His work lies at the intersection of public opinion, political psychology, and political communication, and has been published in top journals in each of the fields I mentioned before, which again is another rarity to be able to accomplish that. So today, he'll be closing out this, what I think has been a spectacular talk series by sharing with us some of his recent work looking at misperceptions across party lines. And I just want to thank you all for making this talk series a success by joining us as a consistent and curious audience each week. So now please join me in welcoming you.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I grew up in Wisconsin, so it's nice to remember what spring is like in the Midwest. It's also an honor to be here. I think many of my advisors and great doctor grandfathers are related to this group. So it's an honor. I also want to acknowledge my co-authors on most of this project, which is Nick Diaz and Jake Pearl, who are graduate students. Jake actually is a data scientist from the University of Pennsylvania. So this is one thing that you may notice, and it's pretty common in political campaigns. And this is a poll, obviously a valid and great poll from Governor Abbott's campaign from 2020, which asked people who is the most radical, and asked you to choose between various Democratic candidates. And what you see clearly is that it's implying that Democrats are extreme. The other thing that candidates often do is suggest not only that they're extreme, but they're all the same in their extremity. So here's a quote from Donald Trump, saying, talking in some campaign rally, he painted a disturbing picture of what life would look like if he loses in 2020, accusing his critics of un-American conduct and saying that Democrats want to destroy you, and they want to destroy our country as we know it. A vote for any Democrat in 2020 is a vote for the rise of radical socialism. So a vote for any Democrat is a vote for extremity. So these are the pictures that politicians paint about the other side. And what we are asking today is about the pictures that people have in their heads about the other side. And I know that, you've probably heard a lot about effective polarization and perceived polarization. So I'm hoping that I'm offering a bit of a different perspective that is somewhat aligned, somewhat not aligned with that other stuff. So what I want to talk about today is first kind of some background, which you may or may not know, about where effective polarization came from and how it differs from ideology. And how, when we started this project, it was explicitly not about ideology. But I'm going to argue that ideology, or at least perceptions of ideology, matters, that it affects effective polarization, affects other things. Then I'm going to say, if we measure perceptions of extremity a different way, or if we measure perceptions of the groups differently, then we might get a different answer about what the composition of the group is, how extreme they are, how similar they are to one another. And then I'm going to talk about some experiments where I talk about the consequences of variability. So if you pay, and I'm sure given this lecture series, you've seen a graph similar to this. This is from VoteView, which is a measure where they use roll call votes from Congress to measure ideology. So this is the among members of Congress. Blue is the Democratic Party, red it's the Republican Party, and it's explicitly a measure of how ideologically extreme each side is. You see that today Democrats and Republicans are farther apart than they were in any time since the Civil War. When I was in grad school, one of the great debates was whether or not this ideological polarization, this polarization based on policy beliefs, had trickled down to the ordinary voter. And so the question was, is the mass public also polarized? Is there a democratic disconnect? And so you had these kind of two different viewpoints. One side would, Alan Abramowitz, who would argue that, yes, the country is polarized, Democrats have become liberal, Republicans have become conservative, while you had another side which said, well, if you look at movement towards the extremes, this really hasn't happened. The Democrats have not moved farther left, and Republicans have not moved farther right. Ultimately, this was a definitional debate, conceptual debate about how you measure polarization. But the debate was more or less at a standstill, I would argue, when I was in grad school, and I don't think it's moved much since. As this debate went on in my field, in political science, Shanto Iyengar and a few of the students, including me, tried to reframe this debate. And maybe we said, maybe it doesn't make sense to think about ideological polarization. So Americans are famously uninformed about politics. They don't understand what goes with what, as someone from here once said. They are often inconsistent about their attitudes. And as another person from here once said, most Americans are indifferent or mystified by liberalism or conservatism as political ideas. So the notion was, maybe it doesn't make much sense to think about ideological polarization. Maybe we should move beyond it. And so we turned towards a group-based model, which I'm sure you've heard about, of effective polarization, where we thought, okay, what is the role of partisanship per se? Partisanship as a social group, as a social identity in affecting polarization or in conceptualizing polarization. So this is just data from the ANES, where I regress two-party vote on party identity. So you know the poli-sci literature, this is kind of just an extension of Bartel's 96. And you see here that the party identity increasingly predicts who you vote for over time. So the implication was we should move beyond ideological polarization and towards partisan, or what you will call effective polarization. And the idea of effective polarization was ultimately rooted in this notion when it was conceived in social identity, this notion that we have groups that we identify with, and when we identify with them, we tend to like them, and then often we dislike people who do not. And it was explicitly in the title about affects and not ideology. And I kind of want to push back a little bit on that original conceptualization and argue that ideology does matter, but possibly not in the way that it has in previous literature. So I'm sure you've seen a variant of this recently. This just shows growing effective polarization, so difference in feeling thermometers over time. To show you, so the conception that, according to some, is that ideological polarization leads to effective polarization. And there's not great evidence that this is the case. This is data from some study I had in 2018, where it's cross-leg models, so these are just correlations, but they're indicative of this weak relationship, where I measure ideological consistency, which is Alan Abramowitz's measure of ideological polarization and effective polarization, and just run a cross-leg model predicting effective polarization. What you see is that effective polarization only weakly predicts lagged effective polarization only weakly predicts ideological polarization, and you see this relationship the same the other way. So this is not dispositive. It doesn't, it's not causal. It shows you that there isn't much relationship in the individual level between how polarized they are and how effectively polarized they are. But I want to talk about perceptions, or at least ideological positions, in a different way. Not necessarily your own ideological positions, which may or may not matter, but perceptions of ideological positions and how they may or may not matter. So there has been a lot of work in this area that I'm sure that some of you have heard in the past few months, I guess, about the role of policy perceptions. So this is a study I ran a few years ago, which is typical of this kind of research, where respondents are shown a vignette of some hypothetical candidate. So here they're just shown, here's some information about him. Then they're either given just basic info or basic info plus a party ID, basic info plus some policy information, and basic info plus they took an extreme policy position. So here they're strongly opposed government-run healthcare, they're pro-life, etc. And then afterwards, they're asked to rate these people. So this is kind of published this, but other people have done similar studies. And what you see is if you regress how the people feel about that candidate, if you just give the in-party or out-party cue, they like in-party members, they dislike out-party members, but they also care about policy positions, possibly more than they care about party positions. So if they're an in-party moderate, they don't like them very much, or like them less. If they're an in-party extremist, they like them a lot. If they're an out-party moderate, they're lukewarm about them. If they're an out-party extremist, they dislike them a lot. And you don't see much difference when you include the interactions. So there's clearly this policy to affect link, where my feelings towards someone else will depend on the positions that I think they hold. People recently, most recently in this paper by Orr and Huber, have argued that this implies that the relationship between policy positions or between partisanship and effective polarization is ultimately spurious. That we don't like them not necessarily because of the party, we don't like them because of the policy positions they hold. So this is their argument that policy positions influence which party the person holds, and policy positions affect which their attitude towards the person. So the argument in that work suggests that, well, if I just give someone policy information, the effect in this confound model, the effect of party position will disappear. And so this is what Orr and Huber do, is to do a study like this, where they either give people this information, suppose you meet a person who who works as a waiter, is from Colorado and is a Republican, how warm are your feelings towards this person? Or they give, so this is just this kind of confounded pathway. And you would expect that when the parties match, they dislike that person. In the confound model, they basically say, well, just give them the policy information and that effect should go away, right? And this is exactly what they find, that when a person shares a party ID with someone, this is how much they like them more, 20 points more. But when you give them this additional information, it cuts down this effect. And they argue that this is consistent with the confound model. Any questions? You can feel free to interrupt. So this is possible. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this, but their model of the world is also consistent with another model of the world, which Nick and I published recently, where policy preferences and perceived policy preferences are actually a mediator. And observationally, in this format, they would look exactly the same. That if perceived partisanship leads me to perceive what positions they hold, it will change my affect. And controlling for these would be like controlling for the mediator and leads to an observationally equivalent finding. So that's that argument, and I won't go into that unless someone wants to. There is this discussion, and there's another paper coming out critiquing our work, which is fine. But the take-home message for me is not necessarily that it's party or policy or party, but that policy clearly matters. We don't necessarily know the route. It could be the mediator, could be the confound, it could be the ultimate cause, but it matters. And I would argue that it's still an open question that I don't think they answered in their rebuttal for what it's worth. But what is clear is that perceived policy positions matter, right? That in some way or another, how I see the positions I see someone holding affect my beliefs. The problem is that people are very wrong about the positions that each side holds. So this is data from the ANES, and I grabbed one question, but you can basically do this with any question in the ANES that asks this format, where I ask people, this question, a question that says some people believe this, other people believe this. This is about government and the standard of living. So they ask it for, you're asked to place yourself on this item, you're asked to place a Republican Party on this item, you're asked to place a Democratic Party on this item. And so people, and this is replicating like work that like Chief Judd has done, show that like you can measure perceived polarization, right? So this is how far Democrats and Republicans actually are. So if I take the mean among Democrats and take the mean among Republicans on this scale, this is where they actually are. And this is the perceived difference among Democrats and Republicans. And you see this exaggerated false polarization. So clearly there is this actual difference. It seems to be growing, or the false polarization seems to be increasing, and it's problematic. And lots of studies have shown, and I think some of them have been discussed here, that correcting for these misperceptions leads to ultimately good things, right? That if you correct, and these misperceptions affect not just policy positions, but there's misperceptions about the demographic composition. There's misperceptions about meta-perceptions, this notion that other people hate me, so I will hate them back. So there's lots of research that basically shows this stuff exists, these perceptions, and if you correct them, leads to good outcomes. These findings, these studies have almost entirely focused on the notion of means, of extremity, that this side is more extreme than that side. But if you look at the data, there's actually quite a bit of variance in the distribution of attitudes. Democrats and Republicans are not all similar to one another. What we ask in our surveys, where do you think the typical Democrat, or where do you think the typical Republican stands? So this is the distribution among Democrats on the same item on the guaranteed job scale. And you see, there's people all the way up on either side. This is among Democrats. This is where the mean, and these are the perceptions. And so what you see is these studies that focus entirely on these points, these perceptions of extremity of the typical person, when in actuality, there's a lot of variance. And the question that I'm interested in is how people perceive the variance, and whether the perceptions of the variance or intergroup variability matters for the DVs that I'm interested in, effective polarization and anti-democratic attitudes. So, past work has, as I said, looked entirely almost, maybe not in psychology, but in political science for sure, at this notion of group extremity and effective polarization. However, there's a few reasons why we would expect there to be, would expect that perceptions of variability also matter. And this has been discussed in social psych. There's classic work by Campbell, by Judd and colleagues and others who haven't applied this to politics, but have looked at group diversity in particularly racial groups. So why would people care about group diversity, and why would it matter? One is that outgroup heterogeneity means that all members are not equally dislikable. There's some that you could agree with. So for politics, this matters because you can build a coalition. It's also, while it's possible to have a generalized negative affect towards a category with similar members, for instance, I don't like red meat, it's much harder to have such a negative affect towards a category that consists of dissimilar items. Like, I don't like European food or something like that. So that's one point. The other point is that this work on effective polarization is ultimately a work about stereotypes, being able to stereotype groups and predict behavior from it. Once groups become heterogeneous, dissimilar, group membership becomes non-diagnostic and can no longer serve as a useful guide for behavior. So here's what we did in this first study. We had a series of online panelists from Bovitz, Forthright, and we asked people we randomly assigned them to one of 3 issues. They were either asked about abortion, immigration, or gun rights, and they were asked to place themselves on an 11-point scale. Then they were asked to do the same thing, but for Democrats and for Republicans. But rather than ask them where does a typical Democrat or where does a typical Republican lie, like the questions in the ANES asked, or the other studies do, what we did is we did this token distribution test, where we were basically asked them, if 20 Democrats were asked the previous question, how do you think each would respond? You have 20 tokens, each representing 1 Democrat. Place a token in a bin to rate how you think that Democrat would respond. And so they would just place people there. And so we thought this would be simpler than other possibilities for drawing distributions, that people would understand this, though I will get to that in a few minutes. And so this is just the distributions that are averaged across everybody. So this is just the typical distribution you would see. This is among Republicans, how they perceived other Republicans on abortion, how they perceived other Republicans, or how Republicans perceive Republicans on abortion, how Republicans perceive Democrats on abortion. And this is Democrats, how they perceive Democrats on abortion, and how Democrats perceive Republicans on abortion. And like right away, you notice that the distributions are quite skewed, although there is some variance depending on which group it is. What I think is a clear way of looking at this is just to first take the means and the standard deviations of each distribution that people drew and compare these. So let me start with abortion, and I'll show it one at a time because it's a lot of data. So this is the distribution of out-party means and the distribution of in-party means, right? And this is among Democrats and among Republicans. You see that they're fairly symmetrical, both toward each other, but towards the in-group and the out-group. These are the this is the perceived means of each party. And this is the actual means of each party. So this is the actual in-party mean Democrats, actual out-party mean of Republicans, and so on. And what you see is when you look at the means of this token distribution assignment, what you see is that they're not that inaccurate. That this is an 11-point scale, there may be half a point off when you ask them to estimate distributions this way. And if you look across issues, you see a lot of accuracy. So again, these are the perception. Each distribution here is the distribution that people drew. These are the actual, these are the perceived, these are the perceived and these are the actual. And you see that in a lot of cases, people are just right on the dot for how they perceive the group and how the group actually thought. Now turning to perceived standard deviation. So the previous slide, I just took the mean of each distribution and plotted it. This slide, I'm taking the standard deviation of each distribution. Again, this is just abortion, and you see heavily skewed people, standard deviations are around 1. People don't see much difference between each person. These are the perceived in-party, perceived out-party standard deviation. You see that, first of all, the standard deviations are quite similar to each other. But then if you compare this to where people actually are, so if you took the actual standard deviation of each distribution, you see that people are really off. So by a factor of 3, essentially. So you see the same thing regardless of issue. So to conclude, what you see across these is that people are using this elicitation method, and we'll talk more about, like, is this the right elicitation method? People are quite accurate when it comes to means and very inaccurate when it comes to variability. And to show you kind of how off people are, what you can do is I take the actual means or actual standard deviations. In this case, this is actual standard deviations minus the perceived standard deviation. And I just plot effect sizes, so just standardize it. You see that the Cohen's d is roughly -3 over here. And then for means, they're pretty much right on. So it's interesting and potentially consequential. There's, there's a possibility that we're just picking up noise, that maybe people didn't understand the task. So we tested this in a couple of ways. If it was just noise, we would expect the most numerate people to answer differently than the least numerate people. So you would expect that the most numerate people, the people who are good at math, to understand the task and give different responses than people who did not, or less numerate. Secondly, you would expect that if this was just partisan cheerleading, so partisan cheerleading is this notion that people are just, want to root against the other side or root for their side, or they're mindlessly clicking. It's hard to tell, differentiate them in this case. You would expect there to be big differences if you paid them to be accurate. If we told them, if we said, if you're paying attention, we'll give you more money. If you're accurate, we'll give you more money. And finally, we have this predictive validity question. If it's noise, we wouldn't really expect a relationship with the DVs. I'll show you, I think, evidence that these measures are meaningful. So are people just enumerate? We asked people this measure, the Schwartz numeracy scale. So it's online. We asked them to be not cheap, but take that as you will. So it's a bunch of questions about how good they are at math. And so first is the accuracy of the perceived attitude of average person. So this is the accuracy of how of their perceptions of the average. And what you see in medium, low, high, high is people who are very numerate, low, light gray, people who are less numerate. What you see, if anything, is that people who are, so this is among Democrats, among Republicans, people who are highly numerate think the other side is more extreme in the right way. And you see this to both sides, and people who are less numerate think that they're extreme in the wrong way. That they think that Democrats are more conservative on abortion than they actually are. So this is with averages, but if you look among attitude diversity, so the standard deviation measure, we really don't see any differences with numeracy. So our conclusion from this is that people are understanding this measure, but it's affecting, if numeracy is affecting anything, it's affecting the intercept, not necessarily the variability. So another possibility is that they are just kind of lazily clicking, or they're clicking in a way that just indicates partisan cheerleading. So what we did, follow-up study, we asked 2,000 people in Mechanical Turk with cloud research approved participants, so we try to make them a little more attentive. We randomly assigned them to issues again. And they were asked to rate themselves on the same scale, and then randomly assigned to 3 different conditions. They were first asked this typical question that's on the ANES, in other words, where do you think most Democrats are? Where do you think most Republicans are? So this is the typical question. This is for an ancillary question, but I think it will be important later. Then they were asked the same distribution task as in the previous experiment, or in the incentivized condition, they were told that we had already conducted a survey, and it's true, we didn't lie to them, and that there will be a drawing to reward correct answers. So we told them the closer your guess is to the actual distribution of the out party or in party positions, the more likely you are to win a $100 bonus payment. So we try to get them to get out of this mindless clicking to answer thoughtfully. And then afterwards, we ask them this attention check question. Mechanical Turk participants, they get, they have a bad reputation, but they're actually very attentive compared to other people. So on our sample of 1,995 people, 2,000 people passed the attention check, which was simply what policy were you just asked about. And the distributions they drew with Mechanical Turk were not really different from the distributions with the other. So this is the effects of incentives on perceived attitude diversity. You see really nothing. That people who are incentivized gave essentially the same standard deviation as people who were not incentivized. But if we look at means instead, you see something different again. So this is the point estimate. This is the typical measure. This is no incentives, and this is incentives. And again, these are each one of these is an issue among Republican respondents and among Democratic respondents. So what you see is that if you just ask the point estimate question, people see kind of massive differences between the two parties. With no incentives, the difference is smaller. And then if you incentivize people, the difference gets even smaller. So the implication, in my mind at least, is that the perceived polarization question that's typical often is picking up. It can do two things. I mean, there's two different psychological processes I would like to hear your opinion on. But it could also be partly explained by kind of inattention, or at least satisficing. We didn't randomize people in the point estimate condition to be incentivized or not. We should have, but we didn't think about that. So one conclusion from this work is that perceptions of extremity are a function of the elicitation method. I can't argue, I'll talk about this in a bit, that one elicitation method is capturing the true attitude of how people are perceiving things. Maybe both are true, but they are capturing different things. And if you use just the perceived point estimate method, this is kind of the absolute distance between the average Democrat and average Republican. This is the actual difference, and this is the perceived difference, or from the distribution method. So you could take from this, on one hand, people that these things are triggering different psychological processes, or you can take from this that the perceived polarization method is over exaggerating the perceptions of extremity. So finally, we want to validate this measure in some way. And so what we did is essentially correlate this regression model. The DV is positive feelings towards the out party, positive feelings towards the in party, and then different measures, distance from the out party mean attitude. This is from the distribution measures. The standard deviation of out party attitudes, distance from the in party mean attitude, and the standard deviation of in party attitudes. And you see, reasonable correlations, strong correlations in the way you would expect. So the more you perceive yourself to be far away from the out party mean, the less you like the out party. The wider the distribution of you perceive the out party, the more you like them, right? And then you see something similar here. The farther away you see yourself from your in party, the less you like your in party, and the wider you see your in party, the less you like your in party. It's interesting. I'm happy to hear your thoughts on why, but okay. Any questions? Okay. So there's been lots of work showing that these kinds of interventions have salubrious effects. And here's just some of them. We ran a second study on Mechanical Turk, and were randomly assigned 3 issues. People were randomized to an average prime condition, where they were simply asked what they thought the average out party person stood on an issue, and we got the DVs. Or we asked a distribution prime issue or condition, where they were asked to draw the distribution, then we got the DVs. Then we did a third condition, which was an average correction condition, where people drew the average, and then we said, or put a line on, or dot on a line and said, this is where I think the typical Republican is, and then we said, actually, it's over here. Or we did a distribution correction condition, where they drew the distribution, and then we corrected the distribution. So this is what the average Republican correction condition looked like. So people said, we show you how you thought the average Republican might answer the above question with a light red circle. This is where you said, this is where they actually stand on whatever issue you were assigned to. And this is what the distribution correction condition looked like. We show people what they just drew. We said, actually, this is what the ratings were. These were averaged distributions from the previous experiment. Afterwards, we asked a few DVs, feeling thermometers. We also asked about whether or not they thought the other side was a threat to democracy. So there is a lot of work, not a lot, but there is work nowadays showing that if you think the other side is a threat to democracy, you yourself will start supporting policies that keeps them out of power. So if you think the Republican Party is extreme, if you think the other party will try to suppress the vote, you yourself will start, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And we also asked these typical social distance measures. How willing are you to have close personal relationships with Democrats, be neighbors with Democrats, etc. And so here's what you see. So this is the correcting the distributions. This is the correcting the averages. This is positive feelings towards the out party. This is perceived out party threat. And this is the social distance measures. And you see that correcting the distributions improves how you feel about the out party, while correcting the averages does not have a significant effect. I don't think these are significantly different from one another. However, correcting both reduces the perceptions that the other side is a threat, and neither have an effect on social distance. So, how much time?
Still 5.
Still 5. Okay, I can add some more stuff. I'll get on my bit of a soapbox in a bit. So the argument I'm making essentially is that perceptions of policy preferences matter, even if people are not ideologically sophisticated. So people care about where people stand on issues. How do people perceive the variability of each side? Quite poorly, but everyone is similar to one another. And there's in party and out party are perceived similarly poorly. How does this compare to perceptions of extremity? With our elucidation method, people are pretty accurate with means and way off with variability. With the standard elucidation method, people overestimate extremity. And correcting these distributions does move the needle. And moving the needle seems to affect, reducing the likelihood that you think, reducing the perception the out party is a threat, reduces your own support for anti-democratic behavior. So in some, Americans' misperceptions of diversity are much larger than misperceptions of extremity. Correcting these misperceptions reduces partisan animosity and perceptions of out-party threat. The implication is that if you're a journalist, that we need to move beyond the mean in analysis and coverage. So rather than focus on the extreme prototypical member, you can focus on the diversity of people in each group. And kind of open questions, which I have some thoughts on, I'm happy to talk about, is I suppose you might have better thoughts than I do on this. What's the psychology behind the different elicitation methods? Why are we getting one set of answers from one and less extreme answers from another? And the second larger question is, if people are ideologically unsophisticated, why do they care about issues so much? Now, Can I go on a soapbox a little bit? Okay. People who are in the graduate students already heard a lot of this, but I know that Shanto was here and Josh Kala was here, and they have a theory about effective polarization mattering or not mattering. And let's have a few minutes. I can, and I'm the last speaker of the series. I've taken the opportunity. I will, whatever I say goes. So I can go back to that other stuff, but since I have a few minutes. Kala and Brookman and Westwood recently published this paper. It was kind of a big deal in the effective polarization literature, because essentially what they did is they put people in these games, these economic games, and they made them hate the other side. You know, they would put you in a behavioral game with a Democrat or Republican, then they would make the person defect in a prisoner's dilemma, or cost you money in some way. And they show that doing that makes you hate the other side, and it has no effect on effective polarization. And so their argument, and Josh's argument, is that effective polarization is essentially spurious. That what matters is information, which affects anti-democratic attitudes. That you hear all this elite rhetoric, you become anti-democratic. Then you hear all this elite rhetoric, and you become more effectively polarized. I have a couple of hypotheses of why I'm not so ready to give up on the notion that effective polarization is inconsequential to political behavior in democratic politics. And it's all basically to do with this notion that this transmogrification theory, this notion that effective polarization just turns into democratic politics or anti-democratic behavior, may not be correct. But once you throw information into the mix, once you start getting people to think, or if you expose people to information that makes them think the other side is bad, then it leads to anti-democratic behavior or attitudes. So I'll argue that there are three different ways. One, among those who tend to elaborate, tend to think, there is this direct effect of making them effectively polarized, and it would lead them to think of ways that, oh, if this person's bad, what are some other bad things that this person can do? It by definition will lead us to vitriolic information if we are enclosed in kind of silos, and there's also a Bayesian process. So I probably don't need to tell you all here, but elaboration is the process of adding messages to thoughts. So if you make someone angry, and if they're not elaborating, they're not necessarily going to think of ways that this group is bad for democracy. However, among those who do elaborate, if you make them mad, they may come up with other reasons which may spill over. And so here's a Turk survey I ran a few days ago, or weeks ago by now, where I asked feeling thermometers. I asked questions from our polarization research lab about whether or not they support, whether or not they think the other side supports these policies. Or sorry, whether or not they themselves support these policies, that the in-party should be more loyal to the party than the Constitution. The in-party elected officials should ignore out-party judges. So these anti-democratic things, these are not perceptions. I mean, in the graph they aren't, but I actually asked actual questions. And then I asked two measures of reflection or elaboration: the cognitive reflection battery and the 6-item need for cognition battery. And so this notion that effective polarization leads to these bad outcomes, there's no correlation in this sample among effective polarization and anti-democratic attitudes among the whole sample. But if you go to the top tertile of need for cognition, you see a quite strong correlation. This is in line with the notion that effective polarization may lead to anti-democratic politics if you think about it a little bit. This is cognitive reflection, and you essentially say the same thing. Basically, no correlation between effective polarization and anti-democratic attitudes. among everyone, and negative among the least cognitively reflective, and strong among the more cognitively reflective. I also, they're friends, so I feel okay about this. I re-examined data from Bookman et al. And people were randomly assigned to have a positive or negative experience in a trust game with a out-party player. And they were asked a series of questions about support for partisan violence. And they find no effects, right? So they have a bad experience and they're asked, do you support partisan violence? And they say, look, effective polarization does not lead to the support. They don't measure NMC or CRT, unfortunately. They have education, which is correlated with both. And what you see here is that these are the marginal effects of the trust game and support for anti-democratic. For violence, this is 4 different violence measures. You see that those who are most educated, the experiment did have this effect, where being mad at someone did lead you to support democratic violence. That's one hypothesis. The other hypothesis about how effective polarization may matter is that we know if there's one finding that's consistent, and that probably Chantal talked about, is that effective polarization leads you to, to distance, to avoidance. And so this is again from the Brookman paper, where they make people mad at one another, and you see kind of these changes in social distance. You find lots of evidence in line with this that Democrats and Republicans don't want to date each other. You hear about echo chambers and whatnot. I would argue that this is another pathway for effective polarization to lead to anti-democratic behavior. And again, what's key here in all this is information and the role that either thinking it yourself or getting it from somewhere else will lead to this connection. So there are many studies that suggest that information silos lead to effective polarization, right? That echo chambers lead people to become more effectively polarized. There's studies that randomize people into this. Josh has also done a study showing this recently. An alternative, which I don't think has been looked at least not experimentally, is that effective polarization may also lead people into information silos. And I think this is consistent with this piece of evidence, that if I don't like the other side, I don't want to hear from them, I'm going to become ensconced in an information silo where my the information I hear is constrained, and it's going to be more likely that I hear anti-democratic speech. Hence, we don't. So when I hear anti-democratic speech, if I'm on Twitter and I don't follow any Democrats, and all I hear about is Trump stealing the election, it becomes rational for me to believe that information. You don't even need online Twitter echo chambers for this to work. There's this work by Druckmann and colleagues, which basically shows that people can hear about what's going on online or on cable news from their friends and loved ones who are online. Finally, there is kind of this Bayesian, I call it Bayesian, model of how effective polarization can lead to bad outcomes. In a Bayesian model, your updated attitude is a function of your prior and the likelihood. So that is that the new evidence is true, right? The likelihood that the new evidence is true. You will assign a higher likelihood to information that you think comes from sources that are more trustworthy. Effective polarization is often discussed interchangeably with trust. Right? The measures of trust are often measures of trustworthiness. So hence, in this model, you don't need to be in an echo chamber. You just need to hear all the information, but trust Tucker Carlson more than you trust Rachel Maddow, and you update differently. Again, I don't have great evidence for this, but the closest is this paper by Kingset et al. So does effective polarization lead to anti-democratic attitudes? I would argue that the Brookman Collin Western paper is a good paper, and it's falsified this transmogrification theory, where effective polarization turns into anti-democratic attitudes. I'm not ready to give up an effective polarization precisely because I think you need information to get you to the anti-democratic attitudes. And some of that information is the kind I talked about here. Last but not least, I should have brought this up earlier, but I'm contractually obliged to talk about the Polarization Research Lab. And we have regular RFPs for survey time, kind of built based off of tests. Please apply. The next one is in a couple of weeks. The only requirement is that you have your IRB approved. We have a very high acceptance rate of these things. So please apply. You get YouGov data. We also have lots of data freely available in real time about this stuff on our website. And that is all I got. Thank you. Yeah, Nick.
Okay, so I really like this. I just want you to help me connect the last part, which is really provocative, with the first part. So if sophisticates yet again have been found to be what's wrong with America and perhaps everywhere else, then why didn't you do or show us? I mean, I guess you did with the numeracy result, but why didn't you show us whether the sophisticates were doing the same thing as the unsophisticated respondents in the Bovitz sample and in the Yphtach sample with regard to the means versus the standard deviations? Because one thing I was worried about at the beginning is that those samples tend to be more sophisticated to begin with. And I'm just wondering whether you think maybe the sophisticates were getting the means right, but maybe it's plausible that they could be getting the means right and getting the standard deviations wrong, but a representative sample wouldn't be doing either right. They would be more extreme and getting the variation wrong.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I mean, this numeracy result, this isn't necessarily, this numeracy result is with the Bovitz sample. But this sample is also more sophisticated than the NES or the face-to-face people. So I guess one answer is we show that the sophisticates get the averages wrong here. I don't think we asked that for the perceived, like the typical respondent question wasn't on this way of the survey. And the sophisticates are equally wrong here. But I mean, there's always an open question of like, will this replicate outside of forthright and whatnot? I like forthright, but it's still an online sample and homogeneous full of professional survey takers. So
yeah, so the least sophisticated, I get that this is somewhat reassuring because numeracy should be highly correlated with any other measure of even political sophistication, my guess is. But political sophistication could be something different. So if you had any other measure of that, and can you show that these results are not just a function of, or it's not really that it's, I'm not actually offering any kind of criticism or alternative hypothesis. It's just that I guess your theory would predict that these problems, these differences that you see between the estimates of the means and the standard deviations, either they shouldn't vary by sophistication or it should be even worse for the sophisticates. Is that what you would guess?
It's even worse for the sophisticates for the means. For the standard deviation, I guess I have trouble coming up with an alternative hypothesis or alternative explanation for everyone understood the measure equally. It's either that or nobody understood it equally. It's one of the two. Not sure if that's satisfying, but
I can't figure out a good alternative for the standard deviation either, but it just seems like if the sophisticates are doing something different on the means, I'm wondering why.
Why aren't they doing it for
Yeah.
the standard deviations?
Yeah, why aren't they better at understanding the distribution then? Or worse?
Maybe, I mean,
or worse, because they're
or
more.
or it was just such an easy task that it doesn't require them to. So they, there'd be this shift in the line, right? They would all be like here, but the sophisticates would be over here. It'd be equally varied. I mean, the answer that is more congenial to these findings is that everybody understood the task, and just the psychological process is so basic that people, when they individuate, are just still doing it incorrectly. I don't have a great answer to that. I think it's the best I can do.
So I was going to ask a related question, Nick. In the paper, you talk a little bit about the point estimate, using it basically different and more heuristic than the token distribution task. I'm wondering if the point distribution task is primarily driven, or the token distribution task is primarily driven by people you know or have like seen in your real life who hold each party affiliation. Presumably that would not be terribly different by sophistication. Whereas if you're relying on a single point estimate of like a highly salient exemplar, maybe that differs a little bit with sophistication, but I can't quite construct.
Yeah, no, I can see that. Actually, I like that explanation. I hope you do as well. But okay, so I should talk about it because this is what I think is going on. And many of you are psychologists, you can tell me if I'm wrong or not. I think with the typical measure, people are relying on prototypes, and they're thinking about the most extreme person, or they're thinking about the most accessible person, who's often extreme. If you're sophisticated, you might think that person is way out there. You may think of Donald Trump, or if you're really, like only sophisticated people have heard of Marjorie Taylor Greene or whatnot, right? So maybe that's what's happening. What I think is happening with the distribution test is what Gavin said, is that people are individuating and they're thinking, like maybe the first person, and we didn't measure this, but maybe the first person they put down is extreme, but then they start thinking about the people around them, and they don't see as much extremity. Yeah.
Great stuff. So my question is also related to this, and I think it's also related to some research in like HCI community, and folks are like trying to make sense of why people are really bad at numbers and probability. So your or probabilistic thinking. So your study also reminded me of that kind of work. So I'm wondering to what degree you really think it's because people are stereotyping, and then this is sort of making them not do that more, or it's just that these visual, so these are like sort of similar to the studies that I see in this uncertainty visualization work that actually let a lab basically gets people to do better estimates, like better understand and give better number and answers. So I'm wondering if that's maybe another explanation and not that specific to like maybe another like a if you repeat this in some other task where you think it's not stereotyping, but again people are bad for some other reason, you would think that people will in similar ways.
I think what I would ideally like to do, and we thought about this later, is have a placebo task where you say like, I don't know, draw the distribution of Americans who like black licorice or something like that. Maybe that would be actually maybe I'm kind of forcing them to be but something like that.
Yeah.
And then that would be, for me, that would be persuasive.
Yeah.
I think you're right. If there's a difference there, then I would, it would add some credibility to this. The numeracy results and the correlational results that it predicts what it should help me. They're not dispositive, but they help me. Yeah, yeah, I mean that's all I got.
But even I should say, even if that was the mechanism, that still doesn't mean it's not like it's still useful, right? So you can still predict people.
people misperceive, don't understand distributions.
Yeah.
But also that's how it works in their head. They think everyone's the same. They don't think about variance at all. I think that's fair.
So going off on this, one question I had thinking about, distributions in general is if you ask people to do this. So one question, I have lots of questions, but like 100 people or 1,000 people, right? It's not necessarily realistic for you to have them put tokens
Yeah.
out, but if there was some other way to ask them to draw the distribution, in terms of thinking about the sort of measurement implication of this, do you think that you would get similar effects, or that when you give them enough people, they recognize like those extremes would be weighted less in terms of
This is
what
kind of,
variance would end up being?
I would think that as you add more people, then they're just adding random noise. 20 might be too many. I think one way that you might be able to get at this is like what's going on in people's heads when you're doing this. Who are they pulling out when they're thinking of each token? Is maybe replicate the typical measure, but say, where does your average neighbor, or where does your average family member who is Republican stand in this, and see if that is closer to the individuating measure. The thought is that the individuating measure is similar to when you ask people to think beyond extremes, beyond stereotypes, maybe gets you to the mechanism. This was the best we could think of in terms of trying distribution. People have done other things. But people are very bad at just understanding distributions and understanding histograms. So this is the most intuitive way. But what we also wanted to do is first manipulate the number of people. I think that's a great idea. But also somehow record, where do they put the first person?
Yeah.
And where do they, and like, what is the pattern of these tokens? Is the first person more extreme, and then as they pull out more people from their brain, do they become less extreme?
I guess I wanted, if they're like having to make a flat line and say, okay, I think they are, from here to here, you only have 20 points, you might be overweighting the extremes, or if you give them more opportunities to fill in sort of the middle, if you would see that variability reduce, or if it's like 20, 100, 1,000, you get the same distribution, or if it's like, okay, I know that there's people on these ends, I don't have that many people left to put in the middle because I had to capture all the points. My other question to you was, do you have any measures of social network, like actual exposure? Because it'd be interesting to see if the distributions that people draw differs depending on their, if the point is like, okay, am I actually pulling from examples from real life? You're forcing me to think beyond the prototypical, that if people who have more exposure to the other, like to a certain party, draw different distributions.
No, I think that would be great though. You can do it, I guess, in a couple ways. I'm not sure how possible this is anymore, but you can get people's Twitter followers and then look at distributions there compared to what they draw. And that would be interesting. The GSSS people for discussion network stuff, that's limited to 3. I guess you can ask an open-ended question like how similar when most people you talk to. But yeah, interesting.
So I have a question about this numeracy results and also your elaboration hypothesis. So it seems like your results suggest that more numerate people could also be more inaccurate about how they understand the other party, and also your elaboration and correlational results shows that people who are more likely to deliberate, like among those people, the correlation between effective polarization and anti-democratic outcomes could be more highly correlated. So these results prompt me to wonder, like, so what would be the implications for the role of deliberation and sophistication for democracies? Because I thought, maybe I'm wrong, like those are typically considered as something desirable
Yeah.
for democracy. So what are your thoughts on that?
It's not good.
Yeah,
It's not good. It's not good.
yeah, and that is the implication, I think. That and you find this again and again, although if you ask one set of authors, it's not necessarily true. There's some work showing that be more sophisticated, engaged, and more motivated reasoning. And it's clear that the more sophisticated are more extreme. Maybe, I mean, there's work by like Yphtach showing that deliberation can reduce effective polarization. Maybe under specific kind of circumstances where it's very, very controlled and people are deliberating correctly, where you're pointing them to the right information, maybe that could reduce information. But if you just have someone mad and then go off search information on their own, or mad and stew about it on their own, internally deliberate, I don't think the implications are great.
I enjoyed your presentation. I had a question about your explanation for part of the process that's taking place. In the correction experiments, I understand why you would make a reference to a Bayesian process. Have you thought about the possibility of motivated reasoning in the uncorrected circumstance?
Can you say more?
Well, the misperceptions and the increased level of misperception among the sophisticates could be a counter-arguing
Yeah, absolutely.
process, but
Yeah, I mean, I think,
depends on how rooted they are. I mean, there's a sequential set of steps here which you can't sort out in this design. But the fact that a person could feel as though they're a strong partisan,
Yeah.
when you ask them about others.
yeah, and I think I point to the Bayesian. I think the motivated reasoning method is probably, or explanation is probably observationally equivalent. I can't really distinguish them. I point to the Bayesian way because it is less controversial. Let's say it says that even in a perfectly rational world, people can weigh information differently. The motivated way would be that people are mad and then they seek information to defend their priors, right? That's the motivated way, and it's equivalent to what I showed you. So like you have a prior, you want to defend it. That's observationally equivalent to I don't trust, I'm updating rationally and I'm weighing all the information in a totally rational way. I'll see what you say. I'm not necessarily arguing against it because it affects my priors, but I just don't believe it because it's from you. And so it's both models are equivalent, would show you the same pattern of results. I describe it as Bayesian because it's less problematic to some. Yeah.
So two things. One, quite interesting, think a little bit about the distinction, I think primarily in like clinical psych between like rumination and reflection. Like ruminate, like if you're thinking continuously and unproductively on your own about something, it makes you more depressed or whatever, and or more upset. And whereas reflection with others might not.
Yeah.
But that's sort of I don't
Yeah,
know. I'm not qualified to comment on that. But anyway.
I think I don't know the deliberation literature very well, to be honest, but I do think that studies that show that aren't actually tests of the theory of deliberation, where under these conditions are not actually tests of the theory of deliberation. It's a test of, discussion maybe. I don't know, I've written enough papers in comm where they say this is not deliberation, you know that there is a difference. So,
The question I had, and this is, I confess, largely selfish, as I'm trying to finish my dissertation on intrinsic polarization. So you've outlined, I think, two different ways to capture perceived polarization and make a reasonable argument about why they overestimate reality differences. I'm curious which of the two you think is more proximal to political behavior, and consider the third possible measure, which is sort of independent of overestimation, just the Democrats and Republicans are at war kind of measure. Of those three, none of them are like obviously like ground truth.
Yeah.
But I'm curious if you have a sense of what is actually motivating behavior versus what is sort of diagnostic of how wrong people's beliefs are.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know if I have a satisfying answer to that. I don't love these kinds of models where it's just kind of like throw everything in there and see what's because you don't know what's affecting what. Nonetheless, that's the way I got. And you see that they both seem to matter. They both, like, standard deviations of the out party seems to matter, as does the distance from the out party. So both these matter, roughly the same magnitude. And then I think the other mechanism, the other measure of the other side is at war with one another, off the top of my head, maybe have other implications for democratic politics, meaning, it would affect people differently. I think that if the other side is at war, independents will drop out. They'll say, I don't want anything to do with this. And partisans, if the other side of war will, it may have nothing to do with issue attitudes whatsoever. I think this has something to do with issue attitudes. But it probably leads to similar outcomes. But I think, and I wouldn't know how to, I don't know if I don't know, I wouldn't know how to answer it. What do people walk around with or what do people think of when they're answering this question? Or what do people, when people think about Democrats, what is going on in their head? What do they imagine? They're probably not imagining a distribution of 20 Democrats in a token experiment. They might be imagining, Donald Trump or whatnot, or they might be imagining, their neighbors. I think it's an interesting question to take off that it is.
This is just a question about how many different techniques, elicitation techniques you've tried. So I don't know how to program these things, but I know when I show my undergraduates about distributions, there are widgets where you can show them a normal distribution of it, and you can change the standard deviation just pretty simply.
Yeah.
Have you tried something like that? So you can say, here's where your mean is. And then now we want you to tell us how much variation literally use. I know that if people are enumerate, then they're going to have a problem with this, and that's the reason you use what you did. But you could actually show them normal distribution with different standards, just continuously stretching or compressing the standard deviation, which would solve the problem of not having enough.
Seems normality.
Yeah, it does make some assumptions, but you can't, talk to them about skewness and heteroscedasticity at the same time. But that's not what you can't get at skewness and heteroscedasticity really with 20 people.
Well, that's fine.
What's interesting is, so we tried, this is the only one, right? Partly because we didn't think people would understand that. There is a possibility this would also lead to another psychological mechanism where we are forcing people to individuate. We're forcing them to take a token, put it down. Maybe they're thinking, and I don't know if it's specific people, like specific people. If I'm drawing a distribution, I'm still thinking in aggregates, probably. That's my hunch. Yeah,
I don't know, you're a creative guy, you could think of a way to describe the distribution that didn't sound mathy, and you could just say, I don't know what, but you have seen ChatGPT, you guys.
To tell me how to do it. Yeah, I think it would be interesting to try a variety, see if it leads to different outcomes. Yeah, I think one main conclusion is that we should just move beyond me in this literature. So how we do that, I'm not sure yet. This is our first.
Now, this is clearly cool. It's definitely new. This is different than what we've knew before. So this is a contribution.
So building on that, like you made a comment about what people are walking around with in their head. So it's interesting to think about like researchers moving beyond asking people about the meaning, right? And we're still trying to capture, like figure out how to ask people what they're actually like, how do we capture what they're actually experiencing when they think it? And so that was my question, like, what are the implications of this then? Like, do you think people, like, is the implication that we need to get people to think about the diversity, which comes back to those who are here that I mentioned before with animosity, like seeing in-group dissent and realizing not everyone has the same position, like is it something like that? Is this the belief that people are doing this and we just need to correct how we're measuring it, or that, like, I guess that's the, like, how does this then fit with sort of what you think is happening real world,
I mean,
and what
I
the
think
implications are real world for this?
So I can't answer the first one on what's going on in their heads. And I think it's an interesting question, possibly all come up at different times. Like, don't know how memory works and people and stuff. I think the implications are much clearer that our research and but particularly journalism that focuses on individuals, and there is lots of research showing that kind of what's called episodic coverage where it focuses on individuals has other detrimental effects, but focusing on one specific individual may have other negative impacts. And so one aspect for journalism is to somehow, how do we not just talk to a bunch of people in a diner in Ohio, but like how do we capture the diversity of voices in an area and show that parties are diverse coalitions. That's a job for journalists, I suppose. The other implication is, and maybe a future research study, is to see how the people we're using for these are almost certainly elites at the first cut. And there's work showing that the elites who make it to Fox News are probably, I mean, I know that they're more extreme. I know there's research on that, they're more extreme. But I don't think there's work showing if they're all similar to one another. But it's showing, the entire range of voices in each party would probably be helpful.
Your point is the journalists are who we need to
Yeah.
targeting. Okay.
Professor Dunning gave a talk earlier this semester in which he described this phenomenon where people have a tendency to accept false statements that support the ideology of their own party and discredit true statements that support the ideology of the opposing party, which would seem to be a powerful feedback loop for increasing polarization.
Yeah, and that would be the same argument as the motivated reasoning explanation, especially if you're mad, right? If you're mad at the other side, then you are more likely to accept false information about the other party. So I don't know if it's Bayesian or motivated reasoning, as Professor Dunning talked about. I think that's kind of an academic question, was you see the same effect. But ultimately, I kind of reject this notion that affective polarization doesn't matter for democratic politics because it leads to different information processing like that.
I have a question. So you've been talking a lot about, right, there's about like 20 individual actors And that would lead me to believe that people would have a wider spread of their standard deviations, because we're thinking of individual friends, I might think, oh, this person actually is moderate, this person is extreme, but you seem to find the opposite effect, that is, they have smaller standard deviations, and so I'm trying to like figure out that psychology, and I guess I'm curious what your take is on that.
Well, let me show you the average, so this is helpful. This is, so we just took the average distribution. And yeah, I mean, the answer is that people are just don't understand it, or they may understand the measure, but they don't understand the distribution of attitudes in the world. They think that all Republicans are like one another. And I mean, it's an interesting question of like, what happens if you start adding more? I think that's like, do they start filling up the other side, or if the distributions look similarly skewed? But yeah, I don't know if the psychologists in the room have an idea. I'd be happy to hear it.
I'm wondering if you're thinking about maybe like treating this as some sort of treatment and seeing if actually it changed, like, you know, asking someone to give you the answers that they normally give you for like an average Democrat versus getting them to reflect, like think. You're not just giving them these uncertainty visualizations, you're also asking them to reflect in a deeper way. And then if you ask these two kind of groups stereotyping questions, if you would get, or any sort of outcome variable that you might be interested in, if you would imagine that you would get results, because I think this is really cool. You're like bringing all these, the uncertainty visualizations, like reflection, which is sort of a bunch of work in education research, and somehow you're getting people to be more accurate. And I wonder if it has these other consequences as well. Not that we can get people to be giving us these distributions on a daily basis, but
yeah, I don't really have a good answer. It is forcing them to engage in a task that they're not really doing, and a reflection. And that may be causing this. The reflection is probably one reason why people are more accurate. I don't know why there isn't more variance, why it's so wrong. But
I guess I wasn't asking about that. I was asking more that you ask people to reflect on the variance as opposed to just asking them to give you a point estimate. Like those outcome variables that other things that we're interested in, once you put them in one of you, so a randomized experiment basically, or just of that sort, where at the end you ask people questions around stereotyping or other things, like would you expect asking people to reflect is going to change these outcome variables?
It would be a really easy and scalable intervention. You don't have to do this whole token thing, which is kind of annoying. This was originally a multi-wave study, this study 1, but we screwed up the coding, and so it became study 1, study 2, study 3. So the token test can be kind of annoying, but just asking people think about group variability. I don't know if psychologists have done this already, but think about the diversity of voices in each party. Will this have an effect? The only issue is if they're very wrong. I don't know. I mean, one issue with this experiment is that we didn't have a true control condition. We're comparing prime to correction prime, and so we don't know what would happen if we just said we compared nothing to the prime, where we asked people to reflect. And so maybe that also reduces, this thinking about the other side, reduces effective polarization. I don't know the answer to that. It's interesting.
We hit 5 o'clock, so thank you so much, and thanks again for coming out this semester.
Thank you.